This morning, we come to the conclusion of our study of Matthew's Gospel. And over the last year and a half or so, we've learned a lot of things. Especially, we've learned a lot of things about Jesus. About where he came from, who he was, what he did, what he taught. But frankly, none of that matters without the resurrection. Indeed, so much of what he taught would not be true without the resurrection. This week, Natalia and I do a lot of reading each week for either preparing for our time together or just simply developing our own pastoral and worship and theological skills. This week we've done a lot of heavy reading, difficult reading about the experiences of people in our world. People who have had the most terrible things done to them. Things they did not deserve. You cannot say to people, love your enemies, without the resurrection. Jesus cannot even claim that he is the Messiah without the resurrection. He's just another guy who got crucified by the Roman Empire. There were lots of them. Thousands of them. And that is why I would argue that the resurrection of Jesus is the most important and perhaps even the most powerful act that God has ever initiated. Even more powerful than creating the entire universe. This is not merely the bringing of one dead man back to life. It does so much more than that. Let's begin by thinking about the evidentiary power of the resurrection. What do I mean by that? Well, the resurrection's power to serve as evidence, to help prove things, and specifically to prove things about Jesus. To prove Jesus right. The resurrection proves Jesus right about himself. It proves that he is in fact God's Son. That he did in fact live a life of perfect obedience to God. It proves that Jesus was right about God's plan. You got to remember, it wasn't just the religious authorities who thought Jesus was all wrong about how God would bring about his purposes in this world. His own disciples didn't understand it. Couldn't understand it. And yet, the resurrection demonstrates that Jesus was on the right track, that he was doing what God wanted him to do. Death is not the final verdict, the resurrection is. The resurrection even shows that Jesus was right about his opponents. I want you to look, Natalia didn't read them, but I want you to look at verses 11 through 15. Okay? Now, Jesus had, on more than one occasion, told the religious authorities, hey, the real issue here is not me. It's the fact that you don't believe me. What more do I have to do for you to believe me? And Jesus got this long list of miracles that he has performed, and he has taught accurately about the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, and the writings. What more does he have to do to demonstrate that? Well, when Jesus is being crucified, the religious authorities finally answer his question. They finally answer his question. Of course, they're mocking him among themselves, but they do finally answer the question. They say, okay, if he's really the Messiah, let him come down from the cross. Then we'll believe him. But look there at verses 11 through 15. What you see is that Jesus does something even more remarkable. He doesn't just come down off the cross. He dies and then rises from the dead. And they know that this is what has happened. How do they know? Because the Roman soldiers who were guarding the tomb tell him so. Tell them so, I should say. Now, Jesus doesn't go to the palace of the high priest and walk in and say, stroll in, Caiaphas, you tried to kill me. Guess what? You failed. He doesn't do that. He does not do that. But he does the next best thing. Because these Roman soldiers have no incentive to go to the religious authorities and tell them what happened. When you were a Roman soldier and you were given an assignment, especially if that assignment involved a prisoner, for you to fail to discharge your assignment was a death penalty offense. And so, these soldiers, what are they going to do? The story's going to get around, so what do? They're like, okay, we've got, how are we going to get out of this one? We know what we saw. So they go to the religious authorities. Now, how did the religious authorities react? If you're looking there at verses 11 through 15, how do they react? Do they go, oops, we shouldn't have done that. That was really stupid. We need to go find the disciples of this Jesus guy and somehow see if we can undo what we did. No, that's not how they reacted. They did what we always do as humans, it feels like. They covered it up. They were like, well, yeah, this might have happened, but we don't want anybody to know. So they pay off the soldiers to tell a different story. Now, let me tell you something. The soldiers were taking a huge risk. They take the bribe, they take the big money, and let me tell you, it was probably big money. Because if word of this gets back to the governor's ears, the governor's not going to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay? So the governor's going to think, and of course, what's the story that the soldiers are actually telling? Oh, his disciples came while we were asleep and stole it. Well, you might as well walk into the governor's palace, Mr. Governor, you need to put me to death. You might as well just behead me right now. That's what they were doing. But they took the risk. And the thing is, the religious authorities could have double-crossed them. They could have had the soldiers killed, gone to the governor themselves and said, hey, these soldiers, they allowed the disciples to steal the body. It's nuts. The whole thing is nuts. But it illustrates a very real and very serious point. Jesus was right about his opponents. I hate to admit it, but I've been in that situation in a church setting. Fortunately, it's not as severe as what some people have experienced, but I've been in that situation where you warn people and you warn people and you warn people, and then they run you off because you're the squeaky wheel. And the squeaky wheel doesn't always get the grease. Sometimes the squeaky wheel gets a screwdriver and gets thrown away. And then you come back later and it's like, I told you so. But the evidentiary power of the resurrection is not the most important power. Certainly not the only. There is the cosmological power, the cosmic power of the resurrection. The fact that the resurrection redefines reality. Now, Paul goes into much more detail about this, but we just want to kind of make really one central observation. All right? This resurrection is so powerful that it changes the very nature of how the universe works. Now, it's not fully transformed yet. That we have to wait for, okay? But death, for those who believe in Christ, is no longer the defining experience of the human condition. For all of us, before Christ, death is the thing that defines our existence more than anything else. I'll never forget, when I was in high school, a friend of mine, who's now a biochemist for the University of Alabama, Birmingham, was reading some kind of biomedical journal. He was a complete nerd, let me tell you, but great guy. He's reading some kind of biomedical journal. They were talking about how basically from the time you're 25, your cells really start to decay, and they don't replicate themselves as quickly as they do before that time. And really, that's when you start to die. That was very disconcerting when you're 17 years old, because you're just like, great, I've got 8 years to live. But the point was well taken. Death, in fact, some biologists would tell you, basically you start dying as soon as you're born. You start this inexorable march towards death. And it is the cessation of life that defines how we live. It gives urgency to our life, yes, but it also fills our hearts with dread, and more than that, with sadness. You see, if you live long enough, social workers have found your brain will adjust to the reality that you are going to die. But according to psychologist Jim Wilder, your brain has no mechanism for coping with the fact that those you love will die. There is no natural mechanism in our brains for losing someone that we love. And yet, as philosophers have observed, we are dependent emotionally, physically, you might even say spiritually, on people who are bound to die. It's going to happen. That's the way the human condition is structured. And yet, the resurrection changes all of that. Because for those of us who believe in Jesus, the grave is not our final destination. Yes, we will die. Unless Christ returns, we will all die. We will all find our place in a cemetery. Or our ashes will be spread on some distant beach or whatever. But that is not our final destination. We will join Christ in resurrection life. And one of the ways that Matthew emphasizes, if you want to back up there into chapter 27, looking there in verses 57 through 61 or thereabouts, you see this strange occurrence. When Jesus is crucified and then raised to life, this event is so powerful that other people are raised too. The resurrection of Jesus breaks the world order. Now, again, we have to remind ourselves, We will all still die. But as the Gospel of John puts it, even though we die, we will live. And that changes everything. It changed everything for Jesus. It changes everything for us. We can live the life that Jesus calls us to live precisely because we know that this life is not the end. And even when suffering, hardship, death comes our way, we can face it. Not with happiness. Death is a horrible experience. It was never what God intended for this world. But we can face it with courage, knowing that even though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, our God is with us. But this resurrection also has personal power. Let me summarize what we're saying here this way. The resurrection becomes the model for how Christ will be at work in the lives of His disciples. And this is where we really dive into our text that Natalia read this morning. What does the resurrection do for these women who came to the tomb, for the disciples who were too scared to come to the tomb? What does the resurrection do for them? It dispels, in fact, it even destroys, I would say, destroys despair. It destroys hopelessness. Matthew's picture is so deeply personal. John's picture of the resurrection is even more personal. You got Mary Magdalene sitting outside the tomb crying. Because this man in whom she had staked her hopes, upon whom she had staked her very life, lies dead and alone in a cold stone tomb. It is heartrending. And really, the women and the men who followed Jesus, they're just at the beginning of this journey into the depths of despair. They had invested so much of themselves into this man. And now he's gone. And it feels like everything that they thought they knew had been turned upside down. Everything that they had thought they knew had been proved false. Have you ever had that experience? Maybe it was a parent that you thought was a truly virtuous person, only to find out they really weren't that good after all. Maybe it was a spouse, a wife or a husband, who you thought would love you forever, who you thought had your best interests at heart, only to find out they were so broken and so confused and so selfish that they would sacrifice you, your children, your relationship for whatever made them feel better. Maybe it was a church. I told you last week that we read Nancy French's memoir, Ghosted, An American Story. And I've told several people, this was the most traumatic book I've read in a long time. And one of the reasons is because as she dives deeper and deeper and deeper into her own history of sexual abuse at the hands of a minister in her home church, what she finds out is at least 15 people in the church knew that it had happened. And nobody did anything. And not only that, she talked to the pastor at the time, and he revealed that this same minister had abused at least 12 other people. And nobody did anything. It's the kind of thing that will, it'll break your brain. It doesn't just break your heart. It doesn't just make you angry. It really, it changes everything you thought you knew about something that was precious to you. That's what Jesus' death did for these women and these men who knew Him best. And they are just at the beginning of a long journey into the depths of despair, trying to figure out how they put the broken pieces of their life back together again. How can they ever be whole again? And all of a sudden, first they receive an angelic messenger. And then they see Jesus Himself. Can you imagine the emotional whiplash that must have caused? It's not surprising then that their emotions turn from despair to joy. But there's something else going on here though too, because it's just human, you would be afraid, and you might not even be able to name the fear, but you would be afraid, and essentially what you would be afraid of is, this is a mirage. This is a deception. This can't be real. This isn't true. Is it? So the resurrection is intentionally structured in the lives of these women and in the lives of the disciples to dispel fear. What does the angel say? Do not be afraid. What does Jesus say when He meets them? Do not be afraid. He is comforting them. He is showing them, look, I'm here. And you know what? He's also saying to them, you're not going to lose me again. Now, let's be clear. Jesus does leave earth. He does ascend into heaven. That's true. And yet, that ascension is actually never pictured in Matthew's gospel. It's actually not quite pictured. And do you remember what are Jesus' last words? Look down in verse 20. Do you remember His last words? They're right there. Behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the, most translations render it age, I render it world, but either way. Jesus is saying to them, even if you don't see me physically, I am here. Do not be afraid. It's not a scold. It's assurance. We'll come back to that question of assurance in a moment. What else does Jesus do? Because you see, when we experience this kind of emotional whiplash, we're not really sure what to do next a lot of times. Even if the whiplash becomes positive, we're not always sure, okay, how do I move forward from here? And that's even more the case for the disciples and for the women, because they didn't really understand what Jesus was up to, right? And certainly they weren't sure what their role was now. Things had just had gone so crazy and gone so sideways, they weren't really sure how do we move forward. So what does Jesus do? He gives them direction. It's not a roadmap. And in fact, most of the time, that's not what God gives us. God doesn't give us roadmaps. No. What it is it's just go this way. Do this. For the women, it was, hey, go tell my brothers, go tell Peter and James and John and Andrew and Bartholomew and all the rest of them, you're going to see me. Just go to Galilee. I'm going to meet you there. You will see me. Just let them know. Let them know that I'm alive. Now for the disciples, the direction, when he does meet with them, the direction's a little more specific, but it's still, kind of open-ended. He just says, go and make disciples. And oh, by the way, part of that is you're baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and you're teaching them to do what I've commanded. Okay, there's some specificity, but he doesn't tell them which way to go. He doesn't tell them how to go. He doesn't tell them how to do it. All of that stuff is for later. But he gives them an idea. This is what it's about. This is what your future looks like. And that's what they did. Now, I said we'd come back to this question of assurance because the fourth thing that Jesus does, the fourth way that this personal power of the resurrection is expressed is through the offering of assurance. This comfort that Jesus gives. Look there in verse 18. We already looked at verse 20. Look at verse 18. All authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. He starts his direction with that statement of assurance. And then he ends his statement, his command, with assurance. Behold, I'm going to be with you. Don't worry about it. I'm going to be there. Now, I find this to be incredibly practical. And I find it to be a model for how God works with us in our own lives. Sometimes we come to our place of despair because of suffering, because of hardship. Sometimes, though, we come to it because of our own sin. And we think that whatever it is that we did wrong, somehow God can't make that right. There's other things that will happen in our lives besides sin and suffering and death that will bring us to this place where we're like, I don't know where to go from here. And what Matthew chapter 28 models for us is that Jesus meets us in those moments. It makes me think back to the story of the prophet Elijah in 1 Kings, where he runs off into the middle of the wilderness because he's scared of the queen Jezebel. And what does God do? Elijah is in despair. He's being persecuted. He's being hounded right after the biggest success he's ever had in his ministry. And yet now he's scared on the backside of the wilderness. Does God call Elijah to come to him? No. God comes to Elijah. He meets him right where he's at. We see that over and over and over again. Does God send a telegram from Egypt out to Moses on the backside of Midian? No. God meets Moses where he was at. God meets Abraham where he was at. We see this over and over and over again. And Jesus is doing the very same thing, first with the women and then with his disciples. He meets us in our despair. He meets us in our fear. And His presence, His willingness to come and to sit with us while we cry, to walk with us while we die, either literally or metaphorically. That's what has the power to dispel all the despair in our lives. Just this week, to be honest, I was wrestling with some theological questions that are too big and too deep for any of us. And sometimes, I will be honest with you, like the psalmists, I get angry with God about why certain things happen and why He requires certain things of us. And for the first time in my life, I actually believed that God was there with me and that He wasn't going to run away just because I was upset. And you know what? He was there. Not just dispelling my despair, but also dispelling my fear. Remember what 1 John teaches us, that love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. When we truly love God and know that He truly loves us, we don't have a fear-based relationship with Him. And it allows for the joy that the women experienced in their own hardship, in their own struggle, in their own suffering, to come to the forefront. God doesn't always answer our questions. Sometimes He doesn't even give us the direction that we're asking for. But it is interesting how often He does give us direction. Sometimes that direction is confessing our sin. Sometimes it's just relying on Him to forgive the sin we've already confessed. Sometimes it's trusting Him in the midst of a very, very difficult work situation or school situation or relationship, or you can name a whole long list of things. And it doesn't come all at once, and we need practice in learning how to hear His voice. But again and again and again, this is the pattern that we as Christians experience. Christ is with us. He dispels our despair and our fear, or at least addresses it. And then He gives us direction. But what about that last piece, the assurance piece? That's what we want to talk about in our conclusion. Because this is where we kind of pull Matthew as a whole gospel together. Reading Matthew can be kind of scary. Because, Matthew is clear that discipleship is a journey. And Matthew is just as clear that walking that journey of discipleship is the only way to salvation. In other words, it's the only way to receive eternal life. It's the only way to benefit from the power of the resurrection. And yet, that doesn't mean there isn't assurance in Matthew's gospel. It doesn't come from a ritual. It doesn't come from checking off several boxes on a confession sheet or a creed. Our assurance is not in those things, although those things are important. Our confidence is in Jesus. Our confidence is in this one who rose from the dead. And what we learn as we fix our eyes on Jesus is that He is always faithful. Remember what we said last week? After the resurrection, Jesus had every opportunity to throw the disciples out. They failed Him again and again and again and again. And yet, what does He do? I mean, even when they walk up to Him there in Galilee, like Jesus told them to do, some of them are still doubting. Does Jesus throw them away? No. He, at least metaphorically and possibly physically, really, puts his arms around them, draws them to himself and says, hey, I got a job for you to do. And in the meantime, I'm going to be with you. That's the assurance that we find in Matthew's gospel. It is the assurance that comes from Jesus. And it is the assurance that he can give us because of the resurrection. Let us pray.